want to tell you all about the work of one incredible student, Georgia Breitman. Georgia is from Maryland, but when she was in high school, she realized that her school was treating girls' and boys' sports teams differently. So she fought to secure more resources for her softball team, which in turn benefited the entire community with the new field. Now Georgia is in college at UNC, where she organizes students around petitions and comment drives, urging her school and the US Department of Education to improve responses to campus sexual assault. And while not all of their demands have been met, Georgia has said that when students understand their rights, schools are less likely to violate them. I can't speak to you as a student today because I'm not one, but I do know that this much remains true. We have to do more to create safe and welcoming spaces for all students. I've devoted much of my life to fighting sexual violence and to supporting people who've experienced it. Back in the day, I was a student advocate, a community educator, a hotline counselor, a board member of an organization, and a trial attorney working on these issues. It's really what I spent a lot of my time thinking about. And today I'm a civil rights lawyer with the National Women's Law Center, fighting for justice for student survivors. Because of how long I've been doing this work, I often wonder, what would it take to end sexual violence in schools? Maybe you think about the same thing because of what's happened to someone at your school, or to someone you know or love, or even you. Or you care because we all should. As impossible as it seems, I have to believe that it's possible, especially as a parent of a young kid who's about to enter the school system. I have to believe that the work that so many of us, including students, survivors, and other advocates, that the work we're doing will lead to another reality for students. Where schools are spaces where everyone can learn with safety and dignity and respect, and where everyone works together to change a culture that for so long has tolerated harassment. And frankly, where people make it a priority to prevent it from happening in the first place. And where people who cause harm make amends, learn from their mistakes, and change their behavior. So students could just go to school to learn instead of being traumatized by sexual violence and then further harmed by their school's response or lack thereof. Sexual violence runs deep in our society. And I know that ending it requires a cultural shift and a lot of education. So the law alone won't end sexual violence in schools, but it can be an extremely powerful tool to help us get there. And by the law, I mean through Title IX. For those of you not familiar with this landmark civil rights law, let me give you a primer. Title IX is just 37 words long, but it broadly protects you from sex discrimination in education, including sexual harassment. And Title IX turns 50 this year. Thanks to Title IX, there are more women in college, more women in tenure-track faculty positions, and more female athletes in schools. But sexism in schools persists. Women hold nearly 2/3 of the country's student debt. Girls in women's sports are less resourced than sports for boys and men. States all over the country are passing laws discriminating against students just because they're trans. And sexual violence continues to be a huge problem in our schools, despite Title IX's promise to ensure that schools are welcoming and safe spaces for all students. For decades, it's been the same. At least 1 in 5 to 1 in 4 undergraduate women experience sexual assault, even after survivors all over the world said "me too" and were demanding accountability. And for LGBTQI+ students, students of color, disabled students, it's worse. And this pandemic we're in has only continued this. During remote learning, students were being harassed in Zoom breakout rooms and on social media. And then when they returned to campus, they entered the red zone. The red zone is that period from the beginning of the fall semester through Thanksgiving break when 50% of campus sexual assaults occur, especially against freshman students. And that red zone doubled because sophomore students were coming to campus for the first time after having spent their first year in remote learning because of the pandemic. So let's not mince words. Sexual violence in schools is an epidemic. Schools are often the first places we experience it, and when we don't address it in schools, students get the message that it's okay or not a big deal or just too messy and complicated to deal with. And then it continues into adulthood and into workplaces. Many years ago, before I became a lawyer, I worked at a rape crisis center as a community educator. And something that really struck me that I think about still today is how there were so many students who were 16, 14, even 11 years old, who didn't need me to explain what sexual harassment and sexual assault were because they had already lived it. At first, some of those students may not have known what to call it, but later realized that the unwanted sexual comments and touches that happened so often in their classes, in their hallway, on their way to school, was sexual harassment. Or that when they were raped by someone who they dated or a close friend, it wasn't their fault, even if it left them feeling confused. And unfortunately, a lot of those students struggled in school because they weren't supported. And the problem is things haven't changed much since. Survivors are still being pressured to leave school until their rapists graduate. They're struggling to stay involved in school activities and keeping up their grades. They're told not to file complaints or to tell anyone about what happened or else be punished. And they're just not given support to feel safe and comfortable in school. There was a recent survey by a student survivor advocacy group, Know Your 9, which found that of the students who reported sexual violence, 27% took a leave of absence, 20% transferred schools, 10% dropped out altogether. And despite all of this, courts have created barriers making it extremely difficult for student survivors to get protections under Title IX. These said barriers allow schools to do less to address sexual harassment of its students than the same sexual harassment of its employees. And they require students to suffer more severe sexual harassment than adult employees before getting help in the courts. Don't get me wrong, there are a lot of school employees and administrators who care deeply about preventing sexual harassment and supporting student survivors. And there has been good movement over the years with more enforcement of Title IX. But it hasn't been enough. And so students today are rightfully still frustrated, and they're demanding that their schools do more to protect their rights. And schools can and should do more. They're not just places that get to take your money and offer you classes in return. They have an obligation to ensure that you're protected from discrimination, including sexual harassment. That is what Title IX is for. To live up to Title IX's purpose, schools should have not only the processes, but the culture that would prevent harassment and encourage students to get help. What does that mean? Well, first, schools need to create environments where survivors are listened to and where they feel safe and supported. Everyone, from professors to other school administrators and employees, should have the tools to address harassment when it happens. When students trust and believe that their reports will be taken seriously, we help build more equitable and safer schools. And survivors should be given support to feel comfortable in school no matter where they were assaulted. Because a student who has to face their rapist on campus or in class can face the same trauma and triggers regardless of where the assault occurred. And people who cause harm should be held meaningfully accountable, which can look different in every situation. Survivors also need better protection against retaliation. You might be shocked to know that schools have been punishing students who come forward with reports of sexual assault, sometimes suspending them after disbelieving them. But unfortunately, this doesn't surprise me because of the countless cases I've seen and worked on. In fact, at the National Women's Law Center, I've represented a student in one of the largest school districts in the country, who, when she was 14 years old, was sexually assaulted 3 times at school. And when the school found out, she was interviewed alone with the school police officer who didn't believe her. And so she felt pressured into taking back her statement. Ultimately, the school chose to suspend her instead of support her. In doing this work, advocating for student survivors, I often think about how, when I was a newish attorney years ago, I was sexually harassed by a much older and experienced male colleague at work. And while work became extremely difficult and stressful for me, it was so hard for me to come forward. I was so nervous. Even with my background in survivor advocacy, I was scared. I worried what my colleagues would think. Would they think I was lying and trying to create office drama or making too big of a deal out of it? Would my boss even think it was serious? I remember when I reported, through tears in my boss's office, I told her what was happening to me for months. And she was shocked, but also very supportive and prioritized what I needed, which was to ensure that I would never see, work with, or be near my harasser again, and to have my complaint looked into. And I didn't see or hear from him after, and I felt comfortable and safe at work again. That experience showed me how much of a difference an institution can make by meaningfully supporting its victims. The good news is you don't have to be a student or an attorney or a self-proclaimed advocate to help shift our culture and our schools. We can all do it. And I'll leave you with this slide to learn more information. Thank you.